The most unsettling medical case study ever recorded in the American Midwest took place in the summer of 1867, involving 8-year-old Timothy Caldwell in a secluded agricultural village outside of Sedalia, Missouri. The lone doctor in the area, Dr. Samuel Harding, wrote in 3 leather-bound notebooks about a youngster whose actions went against every human nature concept that 19th century medicine was aware of. To onlookers, the youngster seemed normal, even adorable, but beyond his naive demeanor was something that the medical expertise of the time was unable to explain. Over the course of 6 months, 3 people lost their lives in accidents. Near Timothy Caldwell, scores of farm animals were discovered dead for unknown reasons. And 11 people had somehow come into contact with a youngster whose smile never reached his pale blue eyes. For more than a century, the official documents were concealed after being sealed by the local government. However, the reality about Timothy Caldwell exposes a darkness that calls into question all we believe to be true about children's potential for evil. If this story piques your interest, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our in-depth explorations of America's most sinister historical secrets before we move on to Timothy Caldwell and the horror that engulfed Sedalia County. Additionally, please specify which state or city you are listening from in the comment section. We enjoy receiving feedback from our global mystery fan base. Timothy Caldwell's notorious actions started with defeat rather than violence. Missouri was still recovering from the Civil War's scars in 1867. Widows, orphans, and communities striving to rebuild had been left behind when towns like Sedalia sent their young men to fight and die on far-off battlefields. Once a thriving farm, Caldwell was located 15 miles south of town in a valley. When James and Martha Caldwell established their homestead in 1861, their hopes of cultivating maize and animals were dashed along with James at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. Despite her best efforts to manage the farm by herself, Martha's lungs were consumed during the harsh winter of 1865. Their barely 2 one-year-old son Thomas inherited debts he was unable to repay and land he was unable to work on. Thomas saw both opportunity and hardship when he learned that his brother William had passed away at Andersonville Prison, leaving behind a widow and an 8-year-old son. Thomas needed assistance with the never-ending task of farming, and Timothy, the youngster, would need a somewhere to live. War and sorrow had hardened Thomas Caldwell's already tough character. Sarah, his wife, had become irritable and resentful throughout their years without children. In the spring of 1866, a youngster who came to their door with only a small canvas bag and eyes that were far too old for his youthful face made neither of them particularly suitable for rearing a child. Small for his age, Timothy Caldwell had golden hair that his Aunt Sarah kept cropped short to keep lice out, and light skin that burned readily in the Missouri Sunday. When asked about his life before the farm, he only gave tidbits of information. His mother had coughed up blood, and his father had served in the military. After her death, he had been living with neighbors for some time. Adults were particularly impressed by Timothy's civility. He never grumbled about his job or his punishment. He always responded with, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, ma'am." In every aspect, he appeared to be the epitome of a well-behaved child. When Timothy took his uncle to town for supplies in June 1866, Dr. Samuel Harding met him for the first time. One of the few formally trained doctors west of Street. Lewis, Harding was a Missouri Medical College graduate who had spent years treating both Union and Confederate soldiers and had a sharp sense of people reading. He was uneasy about something about the Caldwell boy, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "The child was perfectly respectful," Harding would pen in his journal afterwards. "He answered questions directly, maintained appropriate eye contact, and displayed none of the fidgeting or shyness typical of rural children encountering strangers. Yet, I found myself deeply uncomfortable in his presence. His gaze held an intensity that seemed to suggest he was studying me with the same clinical interest that I typically reserved for my patients." Sedalia was surrounded by a small rural community where everyone knew one another. Although the Caldwell property was remote, it wasn't so remote that nearby residents didn't notice anything. Timothy would frequently be seen working in the fields or caring for the animals on Mrs. Eleanor Patterson's property, which abutted the Caldwell property. The boy worked with unusual focus for a child his age, she told her husband, and never seemed to tire, never stopping to rest or play as children naturally do. It was like watching a little machine, she said to her husband Samuel one evening while they were having dinner. Elena saw that her chickens were restless any time Timothy was close to the boundary line. He'd work steady from sunrise to sunset, never complaining, never slowing down. Ain't natural for a boy to have no play in him at all. They refused to go near the fence dividing the estates and would congregate, ruffling their feathers and squawking. Elena couldn't get rid of the impression that the animals sensed something about the boy that people didn't, even though her husband wrote it off as a coincidence. The first fatality happened on a hot August afternoon in 1866. The village blacksmith's daughter, 5-year-old Mary Fletcher, was well known in the neighborhood for her lively laugh and propensity for wandering. She had been playing close to Willow Creek, a little stream that connected the Caldwell farm and a number of other estates. Her body was discovered by Timothy. He came to the Fletcher house as the family was getting ready for dinner, his clothes wet and his face white with what seemed to be real anguish. He said, "Mrs. Fletcher," in a firm voice that belied his apparent agitation. The search team that hurried to the creek discovered Mary Fletcher face down in water that was just 18 inches deep. "I found Mary by the creek. She's not breathing." After being called right away, Dr. Harding concluded that the youngster had drowned, which is a terrible but regular occurrence in rural places where kids play unattended near water. Harding was troubled by Timothy's story of finding the body, not by the death itself. The location of Mary's body, the state of her clothes, and the precise location of her discovery were all described by the youngster in an exceptionally thorough manner. Timothy responded that he had been searching for a lost calf when asked how he had ended up in that location at that specific moment. The boy's recall was remarkably precise, reported Harding in his journal. Such attention to detail was remarkable for a youngster who claimed to be frightened and saddened by the finding. He could describe the exact position of the deceased child's limbs, the way her dress had been caught on a submerged branch, even the color of the water around her face. When asked, Thomas Caldwell acknowledged that he had ordered Timothy to explore the stream area and that one of their calves had actually gone missing that morning. 2 days later, the healthy calf was discovered grazing in a meadow about a mile from the scene of Mary Fletcher's drowning. Timothy was grateful to offer his condolences to the Fletcher family, who were crushed by their loss. After all, it was him who had located their daughter and informed them right away. Timothy appropriately bent his head throughout the funeral service while sitting quietly alongside his aunt and uncle. With appropriate somnolence, he accepted the family's appreciation for his prompt action in warning them. He said to Mary's father, "I wish I could have found her sooner," with the perfect amount of remorse and sadness in his voice. However, something that Elena Patterson saw while observing from the other side of the church bothered her for days following. Timothy Caldwell's face remained the same, even when Mary Fletcher's mother broke down in tears throughout the service, and when the sight of the tiny coffin brought even big men to tears. Although his head was lowered in what appeared to be grief, his pale blue eyes remained alert and dry as he took in every detail of the surroundings. 3 weeks later, the second fatality occurred. Henrik Len, a Norwegian immigrant who had been a logger until being forced into retirement due to arthritis, was discovered near the base of Devil's Bluff, a rocky outcrop. Henrik was known to climb the bluff to check on the wild beehives he kept and to overlook the creek where Mary Fletcher had drowned. Timothy Caldwell was involved in the discovery once more. He had noticed something strange at the foot of the bluff while he was making his way home from town. Timothy informed the assembled crowd, "I noticed Mr. Ison's hat snagged on a thorn bush. Henrik Larsson found dead, appearing to have fallen from the top of the 40-foot cliff with his neck broken. I called out to him but got no answer, so I climbed down to look. According to Dr. Harding's analysis, the elderly guy most likely passed away immediately upon impact. The only oddity in the image was that there were a lot more dead bees strewn all over the body than would normally be found far from a hive." Following the examination, Samuel Patterson informed Dr. Harding Mr. Larson knew those bluffs better than any man in the county. When asked if he thought the old man might have lost his footing due to a bee sting, Timothy said he'd been climbing up there for 3 years, never had so much as a stumble. Don't make sense he'd fall now. He was always talking about how angry they get when you disturb them, stated the kid. Maybe they swarmed him and he got confused. Dr. Harding thought Timothy's explanation made sense, but he was disturbed by the scene. All of the dead bees were gathered in a tiny spot right next to Henrik's body. There should have been more indications of bee activity along the elderly man's assumed flight and fall route if he had disturbed a hive at the top of the bluff. Rather, it seemed like the bees had somehow gathered in the vicinity of the impact site. Harding discovered the beehives undamaged and without any indications of recent disturbance when he scaled the cliff to inspect them. While they were busy collecting nectar from the late summer wildflowers, the worker bees were not disturbed. Any illusions about coincidence were broken with the third fatality. 6-year-old Jacob Mills disappeared in September 1866 while playing in the woods close to his family's cottage. 4 days after his last sighting, his body was discovered in an abandoned well almost half a mile away. The volunteer for the search party was Timothy Caldwell. Timothy demonstrated incredible stamina for a child his age by searching with the adult volunteers for 3 days. He led searchers through parts of the woods that even longtime inhabitants found challenging to navigate, as if he knew them very well. In response to a question about how he had become so familiar with the area, Timothy said that he frequently spent his leisure time in the woods searching for plants and herbs that his aunt could use for medicine and cooking. Just after daybreak on the 4th day, Timothy showed up at the Mills cabin. He spoke to Jacob's father. "I think I found something," in a voice heaving with fatigue. The well was partially hidden by fallen logs and overgrown foliage. "There's an old well about a half-mile north of here." I heard what sounded like crying. At the bottom, dehydrated and exposed, Jacob Mills was alive, but hardly awake. Although Dr. Harding was called very away, the boy passed within a few hours after being removed from the well because his frail body was unable to withstand the ordeal. The child had been at the bottom of that well for nearly 4 days, Harding noted in his journal. Even more concerning was Timothy's actions during Jacob's last hours. The fact that Timothy Caldwell was able to locate him in such an obscure location raises troubling questions. How extensive is the boy's knowledge of the local terrain? What other hidden dangers might he be aware of? Timothy sat silently in the cabin's corner, seemingly praying, while the Mills family kept watch over their dying son. However, Dr. Harding discovered something that really troubled him when he was in a position to watch the youngster covertly. Timothy wasn't in prayer. His mouth moved, but his eyes were focused on Jacob Mills with a near-scientific intensity. He seemed to be recording every aspect of the dying child's state: the pale skin, the ragged breathing, the way consciousness came and went. Timothy didn't look shocked or sad when Jacob passed away. Rather, Harding could only characterize it as a sense of fulfillment. Dr. Harding used the burial as an excuse to go to the abandoned well where Jacob had been discovered. He couldn't explain why the site bothered him. It would have required a lot of work to shift the natural detritus that covered the well, so it was certainly well hidden. However, Timothy had reported hearing cries from this spot, which seemed unlikely considering the well's depth and the amount of bush that covered it. Harding's closer inspection of the situation revealed something that the first rescue team had overlooked in their haste to save Jacob Mills. The debris had been placed with amazing accuracy around the well's rim. Branches and logs that ought to have fallen at random displayed indications of intentional placement, resulting in a camouflage that was almost imperceptible unless one knew just where to look. Harding could not get rid of the feeling that Jacob Mills had not just fallen into the well, but the consequences were too upsetting to say out loud. He had been put there, and the location had been meticulously hidden until the youngster was too frail to be saved. Harding started taking thorough notes on Timothy Caldwell that night. The youngster was dangerous to the whole town, if his suspicions were right. Suspicions, however, were not evidence, and Harding lacked evidence. The issue was that Timothy Caldwell appeared to be a perfect child. He frequently sat quietly through services and recited prayers with the proper reverence while attending church with his aunt and uncle. He put up a lot of effort on the farm, finishing chores that many adult laborers would find difficult. He addressed his elders with dignity and deferred to those in positions of power. Above all, Timothy provided believable justifications for attending every tragedy. He discovered Mary Fletcher while searching for a missing calf. He had noticed Henrik Lenn's hat while making his way home from town. Like any concerned community member, he had offered to assist in the hunt for Jacob Mills. However, Harding's background in medicine had trained him to see past outward manifestations. Treating wounded soldiers had taught him to spot the warning signs of men who killed for deeper, more basic reasons, rather than out of a sense of duty or dire need. Such guys exhibited a coldness, a detachment from typical human emotion that showed itself subtly in ways such as an inability to react to horror, an excessive interest in pain, and the capacity to talk about violence with clinical detachment. All of these traits were present in Timothy Caldwell, but they were condensed into an 8-year-old child's face and physique. In October 1866, Dr. Harding started his inquiry in earnest. He visited farms and homes all around the region on a regular basis as the community's doctor, supposedly to check on the health of families still recuperating from the difficulties of war. He was actually collecting data about Timothy Caldwell. His findings presented a troubling image of a youngster who appeared to be at the center of an increasingly enlarging circle of bad luck. On nearby farms, livestock had been dying at unusually high rates, not from illness, but from what seemed to be unintentional accidents. Foxes were found to have killed chickens with broken necks, leaving no further evidence of their predation. Pigs had unexplained wounds that eventually turned septic and killed them. Farmers had to put their horses down when they suddenly became lame. In the last 2 months, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson told Dr. Harding that she had lost 17 chickens. She remarked, "It's the strangest thing." When Harding looked at the most recent victims, he discovered evidence that confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. They're dying 1 or 2 at a time, always found in the morning with their necks broken clean. My husband thinks it's foxes, but I've never seen fox sign around the coop and the way they're killed. It's too neat, too. It had taken a great deal of anatomical understanding to kill the hens by applying exact force to certain spots on their necks. It was something far more planned and regulated than the haphazard brutality that characterizes predator strikes. Other farms showed similar trends. James Wickham had lost 3 calves to what he called freak accidents. Animals that had either gotten their heads stuck in fence rails or strangled themselves on ropes in ways that were impossible to explain. Despite being one of the most agile animals in the county, Robert Dunham's prize bull had fractured its leg after falling into a ditch. The impacted farms were all within walking distance of the Caldwell property in each case, and in multiple cases, neighbors claimed to have seen Timothy nearby at the time of the incident. James Wickham informed Dr. Harding, "The morning before we found the calf, I saw him walking along our fence line." Dr. Harding also started to pay more attention to Timothy's behavior during his regular medical trips to the Caldwell farm. "Thought it was odd him being so far from home, but the boy was always polite when he saw me. Waved and called out a greeting like he was taught proper. During these appointments, the youngster was always there, standing silently as doctor." Harding checked his aunt and uncle for the myriad illnesses that come with farming. However, Harding observed that Timothy took an unusual interest in these examinations and asked questions about medical processes and anatomy that seemed advanced for a youngster of his age. During one visit, Timothy inquired in a casual tone, as if talking about the weather, "How do you know if someone's really dead?" When asked why he was curious, Timothy replied that he was worried about being able to assist if someone was harmed when he was by himself on the farm. "Sometimes people just look like they're sleeping. Uncle Thomas says, I need to know how to handle emergencies since we're so far from town," he said. Dr. Harding was disturbed by the query, but the explanation made sense. Timothy's fascination with hurt and death had a clinical aspect that transcended typical child inquiry. With the same disinterested curiosity that a medical student might display when examining cadavers, the youngster inquired about the mechanics of death, including how long it took, what symptoms to look for, and whether people might survive different kinds of injuries. Harding started putting Timothy to the test during these discussions by purposefully giving him misleading information, such as that certain injuries were lethal when they weren't, or that certain symptoms pointed to specific illnesses. Although Timothy never openly disputed these untrue claims, Harding saw that the youngster retained all of the information remarkably well. Timothy's reaction to Dr. Harding's accounts of caring for injured troops during the conflict was even more unsettling. Timothy listened intently, asking specific questions about wound patterns, blood loss, and survival rates. Whereas other kids displayed the normal shock or sadness that comes with learning about battlefield injuries, one such conversation saw Timothy staring at Dr. Harding's face with pale blue eyes, asking, "Did they scream a lot when you cut off their arms?" Dr. Harding would never forget the cold he felt when Timothy said, "Or were they too hurt to make noise?" in his usual courteous manner. By November 1866, Dr. Harding's observations about Timothy Caldwell had filled almost 2 entire diaries. What came out was a youngster who understood death and violence as an adult would, but who also lacked the typical human capacity for empathy. However, documentation did not equate to evidence, and Harding would require evidence to defend the group against what he increasingly perceived to be a dangerous predator. After Thomas Caldwell suffered a back injury during the fall harvest, there was a chance to collect that evidence. Dr. Harding gained unparalleled access to the Caldwell home as a result of the injury, which necessitated bed rest and daily medical visits. He started having longer talks with Timothy on these trips, carefully probing to find out the nature of the boy's views and the depth of his understanding. His darkest worries were surpassed by what he found. For months, if not years, Timothy Caldwell had been experimenting on living things. Dr. Harding concluded that the youngster had been methodically trapping and torturing tiny animals in order to examine their reactions to different types of harm and suffering. This conclusion was reached through a combination of direct observation and meticulous interrogation. It was during one of their chats that Timothy had referred to the cave as a spot where he went to be alone and ponder. Dr. Harding examined the location and discovered a meticulously arranged collection of animal bones, rudimentary surgical tools made from farm implements, and a number of intricate drawings that detailed various torture and mutilation operations. The most unsettling finding was the drawings. They depicted rabbits, squirrels, birds, and larger creatures in varying states of dissection and wounded, and were surprisingly artistically skilled for a child. Notes detailing the animal's reactions, the time it took for it to die, and remarks about which techniques caused the greatest anguish were included with each drawing, all written in Timothy's meticulous handwriting. Next to a realistic illustration of a rabbit, the comment, "Subject remained conscious for approximately 10 minutes after removal of eyes," was read. Vocalizations decreased gradually. Movement ceased after application of pressure to throat. Dr. Harding discovered that Timothy had been subjecting the local animals to more complex cruelty experiments. Actually, Timothy wanted to test his methods on larger individuals, which led to the unintentional fatalities on nearby farms. A more recent collection of drawings, however, that included human forms rather than animals, was the most horrifying find. These drawings, which included speculative remarks on human anatomy and possible means of harm, showed adults and children in a variety of distressed and injured poses. Mary Fletcher, the first child to die, was clearly depicted in one of the drawings. Henrik Lenn was portrayed by another. A third featured Jacob Mills at the bottom of a well, with thorough annotations describing the physiological effects of exposure and dehydration. Timothy Caldwell had done more than just witness these killings. He had meticulously planned their demises, carried them out, and recorded the outcomes for further research. The terror in Sedalia County was far from done, as Dr. Harding would soon learn. Share this video with a buddy who liked dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one, and hit the like button to show your support for our material. Together, let's find out what occurs next. Dr. Harding had to deal with an impossibility. Timothy Caldwell was found to be the cause of several deaths, according to the evidence found in the cave, although this information was gathered by what amounted to an unlawful search. Furthermore, No court would accept an allegation that an 8-year-old child could be a cunning killer because it was so far from the conventional wisdom of human nature. There was no foundation for comprehending psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder in medical research in 1867. It was widely held that children were naturally innocent and could only become corrupted by negative influences or traumatic events. For most people, it was simply unthinkable that a child could be born without the ability to feel or reason morally. Dr. Harding was aware that he would probably be written off as a man whose mind had been harmed by too many years of caring for war victims if he presented his results to the local authorities. The murders would go on, the evidence would be disproved, and Timothy would be justified as a damaged orphan expressing his sorrow. Rather, Dr. Harding made the decision to speak with Timothy directly. He requested the youngster to accompany him on a trip to the far pasture to see how the animals were doing on his subsequent visit to the Caldwell farm. When they were by themselves, Dr. Harding shared what he had found in the cave. Dr. Harding had not anticipated Timothy's response. The boy was captured with no surprise, denial, or terror. Rather, he listened quietly as Dr. Harding explained the notes and drawings, nodding now and then as though to affirm that the doctor's views were correct. Timothy remarked, "You're not going to tell anyone," when Dr. Harding concluded his remarks. It was a factual statement made with complete assurance rather than a query or a request. "Why wouldn't I?" Dr. Harding inquired, sincere in his desire to understand the boy's logic. Dr. Harding has never seen such a sincere display of passion on a human face as Timothy's smile. "Because no one would believe you," he replied. "The child was correct on both counts, and because you're curious about what I'll do next." Dr. Harding was aware that his assertions would resemble the outbursts of a man who was losing his mind. However, Timothy had also discovered something that the physician was hesitant to acknowledge, even to himself. A scientific interest in tracking the evolution of what may have been the most dangerous person he had ever met. Dr. Harding inquired, "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was 5, Timothy said impassively. "Maybe earlier. I started with insects, then mice, then bigger things. It's interesting to see how different animals react to the same treatments." "And the people who died." Timothy sighed. "They were experiments too. I wanted to see if people would react the same way as animals. They do mostly, but they're better at understanding what's happening to them. That makes it more interesting." The chill that Dr. Harding experienced was unrelated to the November weather. Before responding, Timothy gave the question careful thought. "What are you planning to do next?" It was obvious that Timothy intended to murder his aunt and uncle when he said, "I need to find out what happens when you hurt someone who trusts you completely." Someone who wouldn't suspect anything until it was too late. Dr. Harding was aware that Timothy might carry out his plans in a matter of days or even just hours. Past experience indicated that Timothy did not hesitate once he had made up his mind, and the youngster had disclosed his plans with the nonchalant assurance of one who thought himself untouchable. Dr. Harding paid Sheriff William Crawford a call in Sedalia that evening. Having distinguished himself in the Union Army, Crawford was a pragmatic individual who was not amenable to hypotheses or conjecture. However, he also respected Dr. Harding's opinion and was open to hearing evidence, no matter how strange the situation. Dr. Harding made a thorough presentation of his case, avoiding psychological hypotheses in favor of actual facts. He detailed the boy's odd anatomy and violence knowledge, pointed out the trend of fatalities and accidents surrounding Timothy, and showed Crawford the cave's paintings and notes. Above all, Dr. Harding disclosed Timothy's declared determination to murder his uncle and aunt. Regardless of the source, this was information that could not be disregarded. Sheriff Crawford studied Timothy's sketches, noting details that even his experience as a Civil War veteran hadn't prepared him for. "Even if half of what you're telling me is true," he said after reviewing the evidence, looking at each unsettling drawing with increasing alarm, "we can't arrest a child for drawings and suspicions, but we can watch him, and we can be ready to act if he tries anything." Bringing in Crawford's most reliable deputies, guys who had worked under him throughout the war, and could be relied upon to maintain composure under duress. The two men spent hours formulating their plan. Sheriff Crawford and Dr. Harding created a thorough plan to his regular time. Dr. Harding would show up to the Caldwell property with Ludum, supposedly to help Thomas with his pain, but really to keep Sarah and Thomas sufficiently sedentary to make it difficult for Timothy to hurt them. Strategically positioned throughout the farm property, Sheriff Crawford and his deputies would be close enough to react promptly while being far enough away to evade detection. The next morning, the plan was implemented. Dr. Harding saw right away that something was different as he pulled his buggy up to the farmhouse. There were none of the typical farm morning noises, such as pigs grunting in their pen or hens pecking in the yard. There was an eerie silence about the property that made his skin crawl. Dr. Harding hadn't even gotten out of his buggy when Timothy moved into the doorway. With predatory focus, the boy's pale blue eyes followed the doctor's every move while he stood motionless. Although Timothy was wearing his regular work attire, Dr. Harding saw that his hands looked as though they had just been thoroughly cleaned, indicating that he was getting ready for a filthy task and that his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. Timothy's voice carried its usual civility as he said, "Good morning, Dr. Harding," but something beneath it had altered. There was a sense of exhilaration and expectation that the boy was finding difficult to control. Dr. Harding was chilled by the words, "I've been waiting for you." Timothy's use of the word waiting implied that he had anticipated this visit and may have even counted on it as a component of the plan he had initiated. Harding discovered Thomas and Sarah Caldwell in their bedroom within the house, both of them seemingly sleeping well. However, when he went to Thomas's bed to see how he was doing, he saw that the man's skin had turned grayish pale, suggesting that he was not sleeping normally, and that his breathing was abnormally shallow. Dr. Harding said in a low voice, "What did you give them?" knowing that Timothy was observing everything he did. Timothy's response, "Just some herbs I found in the woods," was innocent in tone, but purposeful in word choice. Dr. Harding tested Thomas's pulse and found it to be stable but weak. "There are so many interesting plants growing wild around here. Some of them have very useful properties." Sarah displayed comparable symptoms. She was still alive but in a severe state of unconsciousness. Timothy had been cautious about the dosage of whatever he had used. For the time being, the child wanted his victims to be alive but defenseless. "They won't be awake for a few hours," Timothy added in a conversational manner. "That should give us plenty of time to talk without interruption." Dr. Harding had never had a conversation like the one that ensued. Timothy discussed torture and murder with a medical professor's clinical detachment as they were talking about anatomy. With scientific accuracy, he explained his methods and the lessons he had learned from each death as he detailed his trials on both humans and animals. Timothy said, "Mary Fletcher taught me that drowning is actually quite slow," as he settled into a chair to start a nice afternoon conversation. "Everyone thinks people just slip under the water and disappear, but that's not how it works at all. There's struggling and panic, and this interesting pattern of breathing attempts before the person finally gives up. I had to hold her down for almost 3 minutes before she stopped fighting." Dr. Harding witnessed the ice in his blood. Timothy nodded enthusiastically. "You held her under the water?" "She was playing by the creek, and I told her I'd found a pretty stone on the bottom. When she bent over to look, I just pushed her head down and held it there. She was so small that it didn't take much strength, but she fought harder than I expected. That's when I realized that people have much stronger survival instincts than animals." "And Henrik Larsson?" replied Timothy. "That was more complicated. I couldn't overpower him physically, so I had to be more creative. I knew he checked his beehives every Thursday morning, so I went up to the bluff the night before and loosened some of the stones along the edge. Then I collected bees from one of his hives and put them in a cloth bag." Timothy's eyes sparkled as he explained his approach. "When Mr. Len climbed up to check the hives, I was waiting behind some rocks. I threw the bag of bees at his face and started shouting that there was a massive swarm attacking him. He panicked and stumbled backward, right over the edge where I'd weakened the stone barrier. The fall killed him instantly, just like I calculated it would." "And Jacob Mills?" Timothy said, sounding like a teacher narrating a particularly captivating lesson. Jacob was the most interesting of all, Timothy added. I didn't kill him quickly like the others. I wanted to see what would happen if someone died slowly over several days. So I convinced him to follow me into the woods by telling him I'd found a family of baby raccoons. Timothy stopped and seemed to enjoy the recollection. Doctor. Harding realized that Timothy was no longer speculating about future experiments when he said Jacob was so concerned about the imaginary baby animals that he didn't think twice about the danger. I helped him climb down into the well. Then I moved the logs and brush to cover the opening. I visited him every day for 4 days, bringing him just enough water to keep him alive, but not enough to let him recover his strength. The boy had specific plans, and those plans clearly included the people currently in the house. What are you planning to do with your aunt and uncle? Directly said Dr. Harding. Timothy smiled back, more broadly than Dr. Harding had ever seen him smile. That's where you come in, Dr. Harding. See, all of my previous experiments have been with people who didn't know what was happening to them until it was too late. But you're different. You understand exactly what I am and what I'm capable of. That makes you the perfect subject for a completely new type of study. Timothy started to move around the room as he spoke, gathering objects that Dr. Harding recognized as possible weapons. A hefty candlestick from the mantelpiece, several sharp kitchen tools, and rope from the barn. The child meticulously arranged his instruments, as though he were getting ready for surgery. Timothy's enthusiasm grew as he said, I want to see what happens when someone who knows they're going to die tries to save people they care about. The time for discussion was over, and Dr. Harding realized it was time to ask, will you sacrifice yourself to save Uncle Thomas and Aunt Sarah? Will you try to fight me even though you know I've planned for that possibility? Will you try to run away and abandon them to save yourself? Timothy had disclosed enough about his intentions to make it obvious that everyone in the home was in imminent danger of death. Pointing the pistol at the youngster, he took it out of his medical bag. Dr. Harding urged, Step away from the knives, Timothy, in a steady voice that belied his pounding heart. Instead of being afraid, Timothy examined the weapon with curiosity. He said in a friendly tone, That's a Navy Colt, isn't it? I've seen pictures of them in books about the war. How many bullets does it hold? Dr. Harding's instinctive response was 6, and he instantly felt bad about sharing the news. Timothy inquired, And how many people are you trying to protect? There's Uncle Thomas, Aunt Sarah, yourself, and presumably the 3 law enforcement officers outside. That's 6 people if my counting is correct. So, even if you shoot me, you'll have used up all your ammunition. Without attempting to keep out of pistol range, Timothy took a step closer. His voice became almost hypnotic as he asked, You want to know how I became what I am? Both statements were accurate, and Timothy's ability to spot and take advantage of Dr. Harding's intellectual curiosity was just as terrifying as his ability to use violence. You want to understand whether I was born this way or whether something made me this way? You want to know if there are others like me and how to recognize them before they start killing? Even when they were aware that they were being controlled, the youngster was able to foresee their actions and control their reactions because he had a thorough understanding of people. The altercation started when Timothy carried a length of rope toward his dozing uncle. Dr. Harding came forward to help, but Timothy reacted with unexpected strength and speed, slicing at the doctor's arm with a kitchen knife. The ensuing conflict was short, but brutal. Timothy used the knife with skill that betrayed a great deal of expertise, fighting with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal. Although the youngster was weaker and smaller than Dr. Harding, he was also faster and more nimble, and he fought with the methodical accuracy of someone who had done a great deal of anatomy study. Timothy quickly retrieved another blade from his coat, but Dr. Harding was able to seize Timothy's wrist and twist until the youngster dropped the knife. The child had obviously prepared several weapons and placed them at strategic locations throughout the house. Sheriff Crawford and his deputies fled from their hiding locations as soon as they heard the sound of their skirmish. When they rushed in the back door, they discovered Thomas and Sarah Caldwell comatose on their bed, seemingly oblivious to the carnage going on around them, and Dr. Harding struggling with Timothy. While Dr. Harding gathered his breath and checked on the comatose couple, Deputy Mitchell swiftly subdued Timothy. With his garments ripped and his face covered in blood, Timothy Caldwell sat quietly in the room's corner after the dust had settled. His pale blue eyes retained the same icy intellect that had initially startled Dr. Harding so many months prior. Timothy remarked, "You can't prove anything," as the deputies bound him with ropes. Sheriff Crawford stated, "Nobody will believe that a child did all those things." He gazed down at the boy with a mix of interest and loathing. When he said, "Maybe not," Timothy grinned in response, displaying the same sincere reaction that Dr. Harding had witnessed the day before. "But we don't have to prove everything. Attempting to murder your family is enough to see you locked up, regardless of your age." He responded, "You won't hang me," with complete assurance. "I'm too young and I'm too interesting. Someone will want to study me instead." It seems like we've seen everything, but the evil in Sedalia County keeps getting worse. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one, and hit the like button to show your support for our material. Together, let's find out what occurs next. Timothy Caldwell was correct that it would be impossible to prove his misdeeds, but he was mistaken about his fate. Sheriff Crawford faced exactly the opposition Dr. Harding had anticipated when he tried to show the cave's evidence to the county prosecutors. The letters and drawings were written off as the result of a disturbed child reenacting the trauma of the death of his parents. In addition to Timothy's regrettable tendency to assist in times of need, the pattern of mishaps and fatalities was ascribed to chance. However, there was no way to justify Thomas and Sarah Caldwell's attempted murder. Timothy had attacked his sleeping relatives with the obvious intent to kill, as 3 law enforcement officers had seen. It would be impossible for even the most understanding onlookers to deny that an 8-year-old boy would use a knife to harm family members, unless there was a serious flaw in his personality. There was no foundation for handling violent youngsters in the 1867 judicial system. Timothy was too young to be prosecuted as an adult, but he was also too dangerous to be put in a reformatory or orphanage. Legal experts and medical specialists from all across the region took notice of the case, which presented Missouri's legal system with hitherto unheard-of difficulties. A solution was struck following weeks of legal wrangling and consultation with specialists from as far away as Boston and Philadelphia. The most cutting-edge alienists in the area would study and care for Timothy after he was remanded to the custody of the Missouri State Hospital for the Insane in Fulton. No one was entirely satisfied with the decision. Defense lawyers contended that no kid so young should be held accountable for his acts, while prosecutors wanted Timothy to be prosecuted as an adult for murder. The medical community was split between those who thought Timothy could be rehabilitated and others who thought he was irreversibly harmful. Dr. Samuel Harding offered to go with Timothy to the hospital, where he spent 3 months recording the boy's behavior and collaborating with hospital personnel to get insight into their situation. Although it wouldn't be published until decades after the events, the resulting case study became one of the first comprehensive analyses of antisocial conduct in youngsters. With the same calculated intelligence he had displayed on the farm, Timothy adjusted to life in the hospital. He rapidly became adept at imitating suitable feelings and reactions, persuading a number of staff members that he was making incredible strides toward recovery from his terrible experiences. When talking about his misdeeds, Timothy would cry convincingly, show what seemed to be sincere regret, and show what seemed to be real appreciation for the treatment he was getting. Dr. Harding noted, however, that Timothy was simply observing others, learning how to better control them. Despite not experiencing any of the underlying emotions himself, the kid was able to replicate these signals with astonishing accuracy, creating what amounted to a full library of human emotional responses. In his thorough assessments, Dr. Harding noted that the subject displays remarkable cognitive abilities coupled with complete absence of genuine emotional response. He has learned to simulate normal human reactions with sufficient skill to deceive casual observers, but extended observation reveals the performance to be entirely artificial. Timothy understands happiness as the face people make when they want something good to continue, and sadness as the face people make when they want others to help them. But he has never actually experienced either emotion himself. Dr. Harding's assessment also revealed the extent to which Timothy has fantasies and plans for the future. Once the youngster thought he had won Dr. Harding over by feigning interest in the scientific method of investigating human behavior, Timothy started to share ideas for experiments that, in contrast to his previous misdeeds, seemed almost controlled. In a secret study, Dr. Harding stated, he has created complex scenarios for evaluating human reactions to various forms of psychological and physical torture. His plans demonstrate remarkable creativity and attention to detail, as well as a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. If he were allowed to mature and gain additional resources, he would likely become one of the most dangerous individuals in American history. According to the hospital's records, Timothy spent 18 months there. Several unexplained instances that exhibited the characteristics of Timothy's tactics transpired during that period. Other patients were discovered dead in situations that appeared to be accidents or natural causes, but upon closer inspection, they revealed patterns of intentional design. After seeing Timothy, 3 elderly individuals who had previously been in generally good health passed away from apparent heart failure. In locations where Timothy had been seen earlier in the day, 2 younger patients experienced what seemed to be unintentional falls that led to severe injuries. Patients' accounts that Timothy had been paying them visits at night, standing quietly next to their beds and observing their sleep, were the most upsetting. Timothy's close hospital colleagues also started to encounter strange issues. After spending time with the youngster, a number of nurses reported having recurring nightmares, which frequently included graphic depictions of violence and death. Even after Timothy was allegedly confined to his room, 2 staff asked to be moved to other wards because they felt like they were being monitored all the time. Timothy had been maintaining a covert journal, which Dr. Martha Fitzgerald, who had been brought in to offer more treatment experience, found out about. By arguing that writing down his ideas and feelings would improve his ability to comprehend them, Timothy had persuaded one of the nurses to give him paper and pencil for therapeutic writing exercises. Timothy's claims seemed to be supported by the notebook, which included daily entries outlining his thoughts, his apologies for previous deeds, and his aspirations for future recovery. The writing depicted a young kid who was terribly afflicted but essentially redeemable, battling to overcome painful circumstances. Its language and emotional content were suitably infantile. However, Dr. Fitzgerald was accustomed to coded communication systems as part of his training in European psychiatric treatments. Upon applying analytical techniques to Timothy's journal, she found that the seemingly innocuous entries were actually part of an intricate encryption system. Timothy's actual plans and thoughts were disturbingly detailed in the decrypted communications. Instead of feeling regret or recovery, he was systematically researching the institution, its personnel, and its security protocols. In addition to making his getaway, he intended to utilize his captivity to hone increasingly sophisticated methods of manipulation and murder. From one deciphered entry, Day 47, Dr. F. believes my tears during today's session were authentic, was read. Her response pattern indicates increased sympathy and reduced suspicion. Estimate 3 more weeks of consistent performance will be required to establish sufficient trust for physical contact during sessions. As soon as his coded journal was found, security protocols were tightened, and Timothy's interactions with hospital personnel were curtailed. Timothy, however, responded to these developments with his usual adaptability, turning his attention from manipulation to learning about hospital procedures and possible escape routes. Timothy Caldwell vanished from Missouri State Hospital in the summer of 1868 for reasons that were never fully addressed. Despite being constantly watched by several guards, the official investigation found that he had somehow escaped during a transfer between buildings. Timothy's escape had been much more complex than the official report indicated, according to Dr. Harding's suspicions. Throughout his captivity, the youngster had shown incredible patience and planning skills, and it was likely that he had spent months getting ready to leave. Evidence found after Timothy vanished indicated that he had been influencing the facility employees much more effectively than anyone had thought. In the weeks leading up to Timothy's escape, a number of guards claimed to have made small policy exceptions for him, giving him extra reading materials, extending his exercise sessions, and making small changes to his daily schedule that, while seemingly innocuous on their own, might have opened up escape routes. He spent a year and a half studying that facility and its personnel. Explained Dr. Harding in his case's final report. By the time he made his move, he understood the psychology of every person who worked there better than they understood themselves. His escape wasn't an act of desperation. It was the culmination of a carefully executed plan. Dr. Harding started gathering information on odd deaths and accidents across the Midwest in the months and years after Timothy vanished. A child who appeared extraordinarily helpful and emotionally mature, evidence of systematic animal abuse, and skillfully orchestrated accidents that resulted in death were all characteristics of several of these occurrences that looked to be compatible with Timothy's techniques. The problem was that Timothy would now be older, possibly strong enough to subdue adult victims, and undoubtedly smart enough to steer clear of the blunders that had resulted in his initial capture. Due to his extensive study of human psychology, innate brilliance, and total lack of moral self-control, he had committed a crime that had never been seen in American history. Throughout the last years of his career, Dr. Harding followed up on these stories in an effort to gain a thorough grasp of Timothy Caldwell's significance. After his death in 1891, his private writings were found to include hundreds of pages detailing situations that may have implicated Timothy, as well as theoretical debates about the origin of evil and the idea that certain people are born without the ability to reason morally. For decades after Timothy's abduction, the case's wider ramifications persisted in influencing conversations about child psychology, criminal justice, and mental health care. In addition to highlighting the possible risks of presuming that all children are naturally innocent and redemptive, his ability to fool skilled doctors aroused uneasy concerns about the validity of psychiatric examination. Following Thomas and Sarah's recovery from their trauma, the Caldwell property was abandoned. Both were unwilling to stay in the location where they had unwittingly provided sanctuary to a murderer for almost 2 years. Although the land was eventually returned to the county and sold to developers in the 1890 seconds, the neighborhood was shunned by locals for many years. Shortly after the boys' arrest, Sheriff Crawford sealed the cave where Timothy had carried out his experiments, but those who understood the significance of the site never forgot it. According to local folklore, animals would not graze there because the cave was cursed. In 1923, Dr. Harding's daughter gave his journals to the Missouri Historical Society because she believed that the scientific worth of her father's findings outweighed any worries about the content's potential for distress. The journals are still preserved in the Society's archives and are accessible to scholars who can prove they have a genuine interest in the advancement of psychological knowledge. Although Thomas and Sarah Caldwell never discussed their encounter with Timothy in public, they both spent the rest of their lives using false identities. Perhaps out of concern that the kid may return to complete the task he had begun, Thomas passed away in 1894 after Sarah did in 1889. Neither of them ever had children. Days before he passed away in 1891, Dr. Harding considered the issue of Timothy's wider ramifications in his last journal post. I have spent 24 years trying to understand what Timothy Caldwell represented, and I fear I have reached a disturbing conclusion. Timothy was not an aberration. He was a glimpse into what human beings might become when stripped of the moral and emotional constraints that we consider fundamental to our nature. If he survived to adulthood, then somewhere in America there walks a man who understands human psychology better than any trained professional, who can manipulate people with supernatural skill, and who views the rest of humanity as nothing more than subjects for experimentation. This story serves as a reminder that evil can masquerade as innocent, and that our presumptions about human nature and childhood can be dangerously naive. The Timothy Caldwell case compels us to explore difficult issues regarding the nature of moral growth and the potential that some people may be born without the empathy or conscience that we take for granted as essential to humanity. How do you feel about this tale? Do you think everything was made public? Or do you think Timothy Caldwell's destiny may have been more complicated than the official documents indicate? Tell us what you think of this troubling period in American history by leaving a comment below. If you like this story and would want to read more horror stories like it, please subscribe, click the notification bell, and tell someone you know who enjoys dark and intricate mysteries like this one. Remember that history contains mysteries that continue to test our comprehension of human nature, and that the reality is frequently more terrible than fiction. I'll see you in the upcoming video.